Hey guys, it's Lizzie. So I realize I'm going to make everyone hate me by making this video, but these are 10 lies that Western culture, parts of Christian culture, evangelicals, millennials believe about sex. I am not making this video to judge anyone. So many of my close friends who I really love and respect have sex outside of marriage or use birth control in their marriages, and I do not judge these people at all. I never think that it is our job as Christians to judge other people. I heard this amazing thing in a homily a few months ago where he was saying that as a priest during confession, he never gets mad at people or feels like emotional hate towards the sin they're confessing, because he's like, this is between them and God. It's not our job to judge these people. So this is just presenting Christian sexual ethics. I am Christian, I'm Catholic, so if you are not Catholic or not Christian, you probably have completely different sexual ethics than me. My priority when it comes to sexual ethics is ending things like sex slavery, human trafficking, sexual abuse, especially sexual abuse of children. I've made really in-depth videos talking about modern day slavery, how to end that. I really value consent, and I love that our culture is having conversations about that. But I also believe that when it comes to sexual ethics and what is best for our society at large, there's a lot more to it than just consent. Number one, sexuality and sex is a core part of actualizing yourself. The idea that you're not fully human, you're not fully yourself unless you explore your sexuality and have sex. This is especially true for males, where they're not fully a man, they're not true men or masculine unless they've lost their virginity. I have been celibate my entire life, never had an orgasm before, never had sex, and I actually find it really offensive and just objectively wrong to make an argument that I am not my full self, am not fully human, that I'm missing out on this super integral part of identity by choosing to stay abstinent unless I get married. Number two, sexual compatibility is impossible to know unless you have sex before marriage. This one I hate so much because the same culture that has given us this extremely high divorce rate is the same culture saying we need to test out sex before marriage. Your marriage won't be successful unless you have sex a ton, ensure you're sexually compatible before you get married. And if we're gonna talk about sexual compatibility, something that's really important is having diverse genes so that you can have healthy children, which actually happens automatically without even having sex. So this happens for men and women, but especially for women, there are these things called pheromones, which are these undercover scent receptors. You have that rush, that attraction to them. It's pheromones. Most people in dating relationships make out with each other without having oral sex or sex. The physical part of your relationship can be passionate and intense while having sexual boundaries. As someone who's in a relationship where we're both celibate, I just think it's ridiculous to try to make an argument that I wouldn't be sexually attracted to my boyfriend. And I would argue if your relationship or your marriage fails because you're not meeting each other's sexual needs, because you're not sexually compatible, I think that underlies a deeper problem in your relationship where you're not really excited to make the other person happy and to become so united and close to each other through having sex. I don't think the issue is not being sexually compatible. I made an entire video discussing this for 10 minutes. Go watch if you're interested. What especially annoys me about this is that we focus so much on sexual, physical compatibility that we've disregarded and not put enough emphasis on the rest of compatibility, which is way more important for sustaining a marriage for life. Number three, the Bible does not teach that sex is only for marriage. A majority of Christians and Catholics that I know who are millennials like me see no problem with having sex in a committed dating relationship. And a lot of these people are really passionate about their faith, go to church throughout the week, are in a Bible study group, pray and read their Bible so much. These people are committed Christians, so devoted to God, but they believe that the Bible does not teach that sex is marriage. But if you look at Matthew 19, Jesus makes it really blatantly clear that sex is marriage. He quotes from Genesis 2:24, where it says that a man will leave his father and mother and become united with his wife, and they will be one flesh. Obviously, that's a euphemism, but I think it should just be really obvious to all of us that that is talking about sex. So in Matthew 19, when Jesus is talking about marriage, he quotes that passage. And to me, it just seems like a huge mental gymnastics to try to argue that the Bible teaches anything, then that sex should be for marriage. It's not that it's really conservative, traditionalist Christians teaching this, but it's blatantly in the Bible and it's what Jesus taught. Number 4, celibacy is so hard and difficult and oppressive and bizarre. In Catholicism, the Western rite of the church, so not the Eastern rite, Marianite, Byzantine Catholic priests do get married, but for the Western part of the Catholic Church, a majority of the priests and bishops are celibate, never have sex. And a lot of people who are not Catholic get so angry about that, awful and oppressive, and kind of like, number 1, you're not fully actualized as a person if you don't get married, if you don't have sex. And if you're a Christian and think like this, I just think you're not reading your Bible enough. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul directly, intensely talks about how it's so much better to be celibate and to be single and to only focus on God. Like I said earlier, Jesus was the most alive human. He taught us how to be human, and he was celibate his entire life. But an example of this, I was at a Catholic conference recently, and we were actually all applauding the priests, nuns, religious life. There were about 12 people there who had promised to be celibate for their whole life, to dedicate their life to God. Applauding for them like it was this huge feat and sacrifice to not have sex. Again, I'm 23 years old. I've been celibate my entire life. It's actually been really easy for me to be celibate. It's kind of weird to me that what I'm choosing to do is so abnormal and people think it's impossible or bizarre or difficult. But I think it's important to remember that some of the Christians who were most integral for church history, people who were closest to God, did not have sex their entire lives, and we will not have marriage or sex in heaven. It's not an integral part of being, of identity. Gay marriage is the worst sexual sin and the most awful thing happening in society today. From my perspective, the worst sexual sins are rape, sexual assault, and sex slavery. That just seems to intrinsically cause so much more harm and pain. It annoys me when the church, when Christians single out gay marriage as the epitome of sexual sin and completely ignore talking about things like divorce. One of my friends from church growing up came out to me last summer, and he was telling me that the people who were the most judgmental and hateful when he came out, one guy was cheating on his girlfriend, someone else was having sex with their girlfriend in a dating relationship. And can you guys just realize the hypocrisy in that? The reason gay marriage has been accepted by so much of our society is because a majority of Christians use birth control, get divorced, and have sex before marriage, and do not believe that having children is a core part of marriage or needs to be a part of marriage at all. It just annoys me and seems so contradictory when Christians are constantly talking about how gay rights activists, the LGBTQIA community, is attacking marriage. There's a war on marriage. If we would just look at ourselves, it's so clear that we're the ones who are sinning and have so many issues with understanding what marriage and sex is. I agree with Catholic sexual ethics, but it annoys me so much when so much of Christian culture is singling out homosexuality instead of pointing to so many Christians who are scarring young children by getting divorced, by having sex outside of marriage, by not prioritizing marriage and family. Getting divorced or having a child outside of a serious marriage relationship, not giving these children the right to be raised by both of their biological parents in an emotionally healthy environment, that causes so much more pain and brokenness than a gay couple having sex. The same people who hate gay marriage should be fighting to get rid of no-fault divorce, but they're not. And when the LGBTQIA community is about 5% of the population, it's just weird to me how we're not more intense in condemning divorce, in condemning the belief that a core part of marriage is not raising a family and having a stable home for children. And when it comes to being hateful towards people part of these communities, I wanted to read a quote from the Catechism. This is 2358 if you want to look it up. The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination constitutes for most of them a trial. They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they are Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may encounter. When we're having a political discussion on whether or not gay marriage is legal in the country, that's not something I'm discussing in this video, and I think that's separate from the theological discussion of what happens in the church. That's a topic for another video in itself. Number 6, marriage and relationships are everything. Overemphasis on relationships in our society, but I was at a Catholic conference recently and the speaker literally said that women do not make sense without men, men do not make sense without women. This was repeated so many times, and the point was that our physical anatomy fits together and can create life. But I just really don't like how there's such an overemphasis, especially in Catholicism. If you don't get married, if you don't have sex, you're missing out on some core part of life. Obviously, in Catholicism, marriage is a sacrament, and it's really important for raising the next generation. Marriage is a foundation and one of the most important integral parts of society. But I feel like there's an overemphasis on how core that is to identity. I've had my YouTube channel since I was 15, and some of the most common questions I get are people who are obsessed with relationships, obsessed with dating. So much of their focus and their confidence and view of their identity is in being in a relationship. And I've been single for a majority of my life and have felt like I've completely flourished in different art forms, sports, and activities I was involved in high school, getting to do so much ministry. Being single has been so amazing and important for me because it's allowed me to do my YouTube channel full time, to go overseas to do missions work, to be completely committed to ministry, and having such in-depth friendships. I'm not saying you can't do all of this when you're in a relationship, but I think when we put so much focus on how you have to get married, you have to be in a relationship, it causes people to lose focus on other things that matter even more than relationships. And something that just really annoys me, so Christians will get really mad at liberals, gay rights activists who feel oppressed for not being allowed to have gay marriage. And one of their arguments is that it's a core part of identity, being able to have sex, being able to get married. And I think Christians are causing this to be a cultural view by the overemphasis on how important marriage, relationships, and sex are. Like I said, Jesus was the ideal human and never had sex, never got married, and so many Christians throughout the years the same. Number 7, so many people believe that procreation is not a core part of sex. There is a myth going around that in Catholicism, sex is only for procreation and is not for pleasure, is not for the unity of the couple, and obviously that's wrong. I talk about in so many videos how it's twofold, how every sexual act must be unitive for the married couple and open to life. But a lot of people who don't think like this literally do not believe that procreation ever has to be a part of sex or is a core part of sex, which is so bizarre because biologically, one of the main purposes of sex is to have children. And I made an entire video on why I will never use birth control even once I get married and why the Catholic Church teaches that. I'm gonna link that video up here and below if you are interested. Number 9, consent is the only part of sexual ethics. As long as there is consent, everything else in sex is good. So like I said at the beginning of the video, I believe consent is extremely important when we're dealing with sexual ethics, morality in sex. Some of the most damaging, evil sins that anyone could do involve sexual assault, rape, sex slavery. That's just the epitome of evil to me, and so I really, really care about consent. But I would make the argument that a lot of the way sex is used and viewed in secular society today, for some people it's kind of treated like a drug and all about pleasure. There's a philosophy called utilitarianism, which is all about maximizing happiness or pleasure. As long as something is not in the moment directly leading to suffering but is making you happy, then it is good and moral. I think when it comes to every single part of our society, extremely hedonistic, not just with sex but with food, with entertainment. Our moral system is very hedonistic, and I believe if everyone understood and practiced virtue ethics, so Aquinas, Aristotle, everything would have so much more meaning. The Christian belief about sex is that it is so much more meaningful when it's only with one person who you've committed your life to, and it's so beautiful how the other core part of sex is procreation. Sexual love in the relationship and the entire relationship points beyond itself to creating new life and having children and raising a family. I think that's so beautiful and so much more meaningful. And one of the problems with seeing consent as the only moral part of sex is that in the moment it might produce the most pleasure and happiness, but long term it can lead to really detrimental effects, where there are so many children being raised by a single parent who are not raised by both of their biological parents, and people being really used and hurt in relationships where they get so close emotionally and physically to a person to a degree that was only designed for marriage when you've pledged your life to a person. And so I think it can be really, really harmful when we take sex out of that committed relationship and are getting that spiritually and physically close to different people. When relationships like that end, it can just be extremely harmful, feel even more broken and disastrous than a breakup from a relationship which was non-sexual. Number 10, birth control is good for society. A lot of times when we talk about issues like children not being raised by both of their biological parents or having children outside of marriage, a lot of people say that the solution to that is birth control. But if we look at the results of a birth control society, which is happening right now, it doesn't seem to be making a positive difference. Using birth control as the solution to preventing bad consequences from having casual sex has led to such a high abortion rate, an extreme amount of STIs, some of which can cause things like cervical cancer, which can kill people when they're really young. I used to be pro-choice and did not think abortion is murder, so if you're coming from that position, I really understand your perspective, but I think it's just important to look at images of a fetus developing. The heart starts beating within the first month, and I think that even if you are liberal on this issue, you've got to admit that it at least seems morally ambiguous whether or not it's wrong. It's also led to a huge amount of pollution destroying our marine life. The birth control is peed out, ends up in our oceans, and there are male animals who will develop ovaries and female sexual parts or become demasculinized, not be able to reproduce anymore. The pollution from hormonal birth control is causing this chemical EE2 to be in the water. It's extremely expensive to remove it, and so nothing's being done. And such a high divorce rate. And so many children who are not growing up in a stable environment with both of their biological parents. I'm not saying birth control is completely the problem. If couples are getting divorced, there are so many issues feeding into it, but I think that you guys could all agree with me that if our entire society, so if birth control was not used at all and sex was only in marriage and children were only born to couples who were committed to staying married for life, that would be so extremely beneficial and stabilize society. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!